Sylvia, you can start.
So, welcome everybody. I would like to present to you Andrea Steele. So, he's a scientist, but even a writer too. He wrote an amazing book that is called Ageless, that talks about aging, so the new science of getting older without getting old. And so, at the beginning, to talk about his history, he studied physics, he did PhD in physics at the University of Oxford, and then he decided that aging was the single most important scientific challenge of our time. And is switched to hear you.
We don't hear you well. I don't hear you well.
You hear me?
Now, yes.
Okay, so after 5 years using machine learning to investigate DNA and NHS medical records, he is now a full-time writer, presenter, and campaigner. So, Andrew, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thanks everybody for coming at this early hour, and thanks for having me at A-Life. So I just thought I'd give a little bit of a sort of additional background to that lovely kind introduction. As you just heard, I started out as a physicist and then decided that aging biology was the single most important, you've already heard, scientific challenge, but also the biggest humanitarian challenge of our time. And I want to start out actually by showing you, what it was that caused me to change career and what meant I eventually ended up writing this book, Ageless, The New Science of Getting Older Without Getting Old. So let's start out. This is the title of my talk today. Aging in artificial and real life, can we code a cure? So let's try and unpack a bit of that. What do I mean by that? Perhaps a slightly crazy sounding statement. Well, as I said, I do think aging is this enormous humanitarian challenge. It's the biggest cause of death and suffering all around the world. Not just in the rich countries, but every country almost every country in the world now. And so what I'd like to do is unpack why that is, why it's such a huge problem. And that might be quite a depressing thesis, thinking that if you think about all the biggest killers in the modern world, things like cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia, these are all basically caused by the aging process. They're far more likely as you get older. And so, essentially biologically, they are caused by aging, which could be quite a depressing thesis. And the other problem is that I think a lot of us think that aging is this inevitable process. It's a process of falling apart that happens to all life. We think it happens to our machines, it happens to our animals, it happens to everyone we've ever known and loved. So, is there just nothing we can do about it? Well, actually, brand new biology happening in labs all around the world is showing us that there are an increasing number of ways that we can slow down and even reverse the aging process. And it's this combination, the world's biggest humanitarian challenge on the one hand, and the science that's going to enable us to do something about it on the other, that really makes this exciting for me. And I think that discovering treatments for the aging process could actually be the single biggest revolution in medicine since the discovery of antibiotics. I'm going to explain a bit about why that is later in the talk. The other reason that I'm really excited to talk to A-Life about this specifically is, well, exactly as this question poses here, can we code a cure? And I think this is the right way to think about things here, because although the early treatments that we come up with are going to be biological in nature, I think it's going to be a hugely important collaboration, not just with biologists, but also with computational scientists. As you heard, I did a foray through computational biology as part of my sort of training to get to this point. And I just think it's so important. There's a computational and a mathematical revolution going on in biology at the moment. And I think if we one day do actually manage to cure aging, in the sense that I'll explain as I go through the talk, there's going to be a huge computational artificial intelligence component to how it is that we go about developing that cure. So I thought I'd start out and in fact dwell for a little while on the reason that I changed career. And the reason that I went from physics to biology, toward the end of my PhD, I came across a graph. So I've always been a very statistically, numerically driven person. And this graph was what convinced me to switch from physics to biology. So accordingly, it's quite an important graph in my life. And I just thought I'd show it to all of you and explain a little bit about what it means. It's actually a very simple graph. You got it here. You can see along the bottom, we've got how old you are. And then up the side, we've got your chance of dying in that year. Now, I think everybody knows that older people are more likely to die. But just how much really shocked me. And I think the best way to get a sense of it is just to, let's show you the numbers. This is what the graph looks like. This incredible increase in risk of death as you go through your life. And I think the best way to make sense of it is actually go through and put some specific numbers to those individual ages. So if you're fortunate enough to be born into a rich country in the world, that's what this graph refers to, you start at age 0, obviously, and you've got about a 0.5% chance of not then making it to your first birthday. 1 in 200 or so babies in the rich world, die in their first year of life. And this is for a variety of reasons. They can have a congenital or a genetic problem that they're born with. They can contract an infection when their immune system hasn't fully developed. And basically, it's a risky year. But if you make it through that year, then your risk of death actually goes on improving until a rather special point in your life. And that special point is here. Current 10-year-olds have an incredible title. They are the safest humans in the history of our species. They've got a less than 1 in 10,000 chance of dying during their 11th year on Earth, which is just absolutely incredible to me. But unfortunately, as you can see from this graph, it's all downhill, or rather, I guess, uphill in terms of risk of death from there. By the time you make it to 18, your risk of death is about 1 in 3,000. When you're in your 30s, your risk of death is somewhere around 1 in 1,000 per year. And it's worth just dwelling on what that means. I am in my mid-30s. My risk of not making my next birthday is probably somewhere in the region of 1 in 1,000. And imagine that risk were to continue for the rest of my life, stay at 1 in 1,000 per year. Of course, what that would mean is that my lifespan would, well, on average, I'd make it into my 1,030s, which is just absolutely incredible. All I have to do is maintain my body in its current state, and I could live for another 1,000 years. Clearly, of course, that isn't what actually happens. And the problem is that human beings, when they reach adulthood, have what's called a mortality risk doubling time. Their risk of death doubles every 8 years or so. And what that means is it's an exponential increase. It can start out small, but then eventually it gradually builds up, and at some point gets very big very quickly. And I think the point at which it starts to get very big very quickly is arguably around the age of 65. When you're 65, you've got around a 1% chance of not making your 66th birthday. And again, that's still not a huge chance. If that were to continue for the rest of your life, again, you'd make it to 165 on average. But the fact is that 1% is now a big enough number that doubling it has a pretty significant impact. And so that's really starting to add up by this point in your life. And so if you make it to 80, your odds of dying that year are about 1 in 20, somewhere in the ballpark of 5%. And if you make it into your 90s, somewhere off the top of this graph here, then your odds of death in any one year in your 90s are worse than 1 in 6. So that's life and death at the roll of a dice. Now, looking at this graph, there are two different sort of ways to think about this. The first is, as a human being, you think, my God, this is depressing. I've got this exponential wall of mortality coming at me, inevitably, inexorably, every year that I'm alive. But as a scientist, you look at this graph and you think, well, this is sort of morbidly fascinating. Why is it that humans go wrong in such predictable ways at such a synchronized time in our lives? This 8-year mortality risk doubling time is consistent across time, across cultures. It's basically a universal fact of human existence. So what is it that causes this incredibly synchronized increase in the risk of death? Well, we can call that thing the aging process. And maybe if we can do something about that aging process, we could come up with a way, not just to reduce our risk of death, but to reduce the risk of all the terrible diseases, the things that actually kill us. Because in order to make sense of this graph, we really need to ask a more fundamental question, which is, what is aging? And when you think about that question as a human, the sorts of things that probably spring to mind first are the superficial sort of cosmetic features of aging, things like the wrinkles and the grey hair that all of us accumulate as we go through our lives. These things obviously aren't very deadly, but what they really are is, although they might seem superficial, they're the external signs of a process that's going on the inside of your body. And what that process means inside your body is a massive increase in the risk of disease. And the diseases that I mentioned at the top of the talk are some of the key ones here. These are the biggest killers in the modern world: cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia. These are all the things that take, most people in most countries can expect that one of these diseases will at some point be the thing that takes their life. And these things are basically caused by aging. Obviously, there are other ways that you can increase your risk of things like cancer or heart disease. You can have a bad diet, you can not get enough exercise, you can smoke, you can drink, you can get too much sun exposure. All of these things contribute to your risk of these diseases. But at the end of the day, if you're if you compare something like a 30-year-old who's a heavy drinking, chain smoking, overweight, never exercises person, compare that to the cleanest living 80-year-old you can imagine. That 80-year-old is still at greater risk of death and disease. And that's just because purely they've been alive longer, and therefore the aging process had time to increase that risk of death and their risk of disease. Then there's some other stuff, some of which you might call diseases, some of which you might not. And I grouped this all together into various kinds of loss, things like loss of vision, loss of hearing. And what these different kinds of loss mean, from a biological perspective, is the loss of that particular capability, the loss of a function in your organs or your body as a whole. But what they mean to us as humans is basically a loss of independence. If you can't hear what's going on around the dinner table, it's much harder to engage in conversation. If you're losing your muscle strength, then it makes it harder to get around the house, or harder to, enjoy your hobbies or play with your grandchildren or whatever it is you want to do. And so losing these things, some of them are called diseases, some of them might not quite reach the threshold where we give them a specific medical diagnosis, but nonetheless, they're a huge loss to our quality of life. And then finally, we've got the things that you wouldn't necessarily associate as being aging specific, but they're nonetheless significantly exacerbated by the aging process. And these are things like infections and injuries. And I think that's just let's take the example of an injury. If you're young and you break a bone, you might end up going to hospital, have it stuck in a plaster cast, and after a few weeks or months, potentially it will heal, and you'll probably be basically better. But imagine if you're old and you break a bone. Well, a really classic bone to break is your hip. And that can be an absolutely life-changing event for an older person. You can end up going into hospital, you spend weeks in a hospital bed recovering. That means you lose a load of muscle mass. That means when you come out of hospital, you're much less able to get around, you're much less able to exercise. And of course, we all know that exercise is a vitally important component of healthy lifestyle. So that can cause this sort of vicious spiral. You might contract an infection in hospital, get incredibly sick. So a fall that breaks your hip when you're older can actually kill you. Even if it doesn't kill you, it can substantially affect your quality of life. So, a break of a bone would be a relatively minor inconvenience for a young person, but it can be life-threatening as you get older. And that just shows you the power of the aging process to reduce what's called our resilience, our reserve, to take on things like external stresses. So back to this graph that made me change my career. And as I said, we're going to sort of dwell on this for a little while. So what we now understand, having looked at that previous slide, is that this risk of death isn't happening in some abstract way. There's this sort of myth that you can die of old age, right? That you can just, go to bed one night and then wake up, or rather not wake up the next morning, just in a completely painless, harmless way. But actually what happens is that one of these diseases becomes severe enough to take your life. So if we now look at a slightly different graph, not the risk of death as you get older, but the risk of contracting specific diseases, we've got diseases like cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia. And although these diseases are very, very different in terms of what causes them, you can see that in terms of the sort of statistical pattern they follow, they're very, very similar. They've all got this same almost exponential growth toward the end of life. And so, as you get older, your risk of contracting one of these diseases, and of course your risk then of dying of them, is something that gets much, much larger. To give another example that isn't specifically aging related, this disgusting green mucousy line is your chance of getting a chest infection in any given year. And this isn't just a cough or a sniffle. This is something that gets right down properly into your lungs and can really lay you low for a while. And what you can see is, although the chance, it never gets that low, even in middle age, your odds are something like 1 or 2% of getting a chest infection per year. But either end of your life, either when you're young and your immune system's still developing, or as you get older and your immune system starts to weaken, your odds of getting one of these diseases massively increases. And actually then your odds of dying of that disease massively increase as well. And although I'm talking in the abstract about chest infections here, of course, there is something that's really made the news in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, and that is the coronavirus. So let's have a look at your chance of death depending on how old you are with COVID. Again, it's one of these terrifying exponential curves. And in fact, it goes up faster even than the increase in risk of death itself. The risk of death from COVID doubles about every 5 or 6 years rather than every 8. And what this means fundamentally is that before vaccination, at least, I'm glad to say that hopefully most the countries that most people are watching this from, I'm guessing, are going to have a decent level of vaccination, at least in the older part of their population now. But pre-vaccination, an 80-year-old who caught COVID was literally hundreds of times more likely to die than a 30-year-old who caught that disease. And that's for two different reasons. Firstly, it's because of their immune system being weaker. That's the obvious one, makes them less able to fight off infection. But secondly, it's that reserve that I talked about earlier. The fact that the whole of their body is just weaker means they're less able to withstand the assault from COVID. And that shock is more likely to be something that takes their life. So as I said, you can't die without being ill. These are the fundamental reason that there's that exponential increase in risk of death with time spent alive. And the important thing to say is that most people die of something. They die of one of these diseases. And the reason that I think, therefore, this is such a huge humanitarian challenge is that what this exponential increasing risk of death really shows us is billions of people battling with a variety of different unpleasant diseases. Cancer. You can suffer with cancer for years. You can go through rounds and rounds of grueling chemotherapy. Heart disease slowly sucks away the ability of your heart to pump the blood around your body. And so at first, you might not be able to exercise hard, then you might not be able to get up the stairs, then you might not be able to just do basic tasks around the house. So again, it just saps away your independence. And you can live with a lot of pain, a lot of suffering before you finally die from one of these diseases. The average 80-year-old actually has 5 different medical diagnoses and takes 5 different drugs to try and ameliorate those diagnoses. So, it's just incredible. We've got this idea, there's this sort of misnomer of healthy aging. That really isn't a thing. Getting older is incredibly, incredibly bad for your health. So back to this, my favorite graph, I did say it changed my career. You might be thinking, looking at this graph, I've said this is a curve for the rich world. Perhaps this is something that we in the rich world are lucky enough to have, sort of perversely lucky, I guess. We're lucky enough to live long enough that this is a problem. Now, in the days before Zoom, I'd have done this as an audience quiz, so I'm going to have to set this and just give you a bit of time to think about it on your own at home. What do you think global life expectancy is? The average life expectancy in every country in the world. And the reason I like to do this as a quiz is that people are prone to massively underestimate this number. I think there's this sort of myth that there's this enormous developing world. There's a huge part of the world where everyone's much poorer, there's much poorer healthcare, there's much poorer sanitation. All of these things mean that diseases are much more likely and life expectancy is much shorter. But actually what's happened is that these developing world countries, although they can be much poorer in financial terms, they're often much they're much less poor in terms of life expectancy. They've really caught up over the last 50 years or so. And so I hope you're all thinking of that global average life expectancy in your head now. I'm going to put you out of your misery. There we go. That is the most recent number. 72.6 years was global life expectancy back in 2019. And there are a couple of things to say here. The first is, this is phenomenally good news. It's, I think, one of the most incredible human achievements that most people in most countries are living longer, healthier lives than ever before. But on the flip side, there's an incredibly bad piece of news. It means that most people in most countries are living long enough to get a significant way up this curve of mortality. And as we've just seen, therefore, up the curve of deaths, of suffering, of diseases, all these different things that afflict us as we get older. And then if you translate this statistic, the fact that this life expectancy is so old and we get so far up this curve, we can look at all the deaths that happen on planet Earth. And again, you've sort of got to see these deaths as representing the huge amount of suffering that comes before them. Every day on planet Earth, about 150,000 people die in one way or another. So every one of these little stick figures represents about 1,000 people. And then if we add on, to this picture the deaths that are caused by aging, it's actually over 100,000. It's over 2/3 of deaths are caused by these diseases, the cancer, the heart disease, the Alzheimer's, and so on, that are caused essentially by the aging process. And this fundamentally is why I think aging is our greatest humanitarian challenge. It's the single biggest cause of death, and I would argue the single biggest cause of suffering out of anything in the whole world. So I just think it's hugely, hugely important that we do something about this. And not only is it the biggest cause of death and suffering, but it's growing as the global population ages. So the question is this just a very depressing thesis? Is this just, I've gone a very long roundabout way of identifying this awful, awful problem that afflicts all of us, no matter what country we live in. What can we do about it? Well, one more time, back to my very favorite graph. And as I said, this is humans' risk of death. It doubles about every 8 years. What can we do about this? What could we aspire to? Well, we could look at a little creature like this. This is a creature called the Hydra. It's a centimetre-long pond creature. It's got loads of little tentacles. It catches its prey with little poisonous darts. It's really quite an amazing thing. And it actually first came to the attention of science because it's got incredible regenerative powers. You can cut basically any bit off a Hydra, and what will happen is that you'll get 2 Hydra. And then you cut another bit off the second Hydra and get a 3rd Hydra, and so on and so on. They seem to be able to regenerate a whole Hydra from basically any part of their body, which is a really incredible skill. But as scientists were studying Hydra in the lab, they noticed something really amazing about how their risk of death changes with time. Remember, humans doubles every 8 years. Hydra, their risk of death with time looks like this. It's just completely flat. And actually, it's very, very low as well. It's about 0.2% per year. So we think if we were to watch them for long enough, and obviously we haven't done this experiment because we haven't had this enormous amount of time, but we think about 10% of the Hydra would still be alive after 1,000 years, which is just absolutely phenomenal. Now, the lifespan is, of course, impressive, but what's more exciting is the fact their risk of death doesn't seem to change with time. It's not like humans where every year you're alive, your risk of death increases. This risk of death is completely flat. And this is a concept that's called negligible senescence. So senescence is just the scientific term for aging or getting old. And negligible obviously means just not much of it, not much getting old. And in this very statistical sense, at least, the Hydra can be said not to age. And so when I talked at the start of the talk about the idea of curing aging, this is what I mean. An actual cure for the aging process would be something that meant that your risk of death, your risk of disease, your risk of frailty, none of these things increased depending on how long ago you were born. They were just completely flat, rather like the Hydra. So the question is, how can we cure aging? How can we, try and make ourselves more Hydra? And you might be thinking, oh, Andrew, come on, this is cool and everything, but these Hydra, they're centimetre-long pond creatures. They've only got a handful of cells compared to the trillions of cells in a human being. They're much, much simpler organisms in many ways. How on earth can we ever expect to learn anything from these pond creatures that could possibly be applied to our complicated human bodies? Well, actually, this negligible senescence phenomenon isn't quite as rare as you might at first think. This is a beautiful creature. It's actually the creature that adorns the front of the UK edition of my book, and it's a creature called a Galapagos tortoise. And the Galapagos tortoise, we think, has a lifespan somewhere between 175 and 180 years. The oldest one ever recorded lived that long. And what's more incredible, again, than their long lifespan is the fact that these two seem to have negligible senescence. And, much more than a Hydra here, we can actually start to unpack what not aging really means. It doesn't just mean a risk of death that's constant with time. Because these are macroscopic organisms, they're big enough to really sort of look at and study in the same way as we might study other human beings. We can see they don't get frail. They stay reproductively active right until the end of life. they're still basically as sprightly in their 150s as they are in their 50s. That's to say, not very sprightly. They're hardly bounding around. They're tortoises after all. But nonetheless, these are incredible animals in the sense that they just don't get frail. They carry on reproducing. They keep on doing everything right up until the end, basically. And so this is something that's much, much closer evolutionarily to humans, but it still displays this negligible senescence. And if you want to come even closer to humans still, there is this gorgeous little animal. Now you might be thinking, Andrew, that's a penis with teeth. Actually, this is a creature called a naked mole rat. And these are really, really incredible. They're animals, they're about the size of a rat or a mouse. And yet where a rat or a mouse might live for maybe 2 or 3 years if kept sort of coddled in the lab rather than in the rough and tumble of the wild, these creatures can live for well into their 30s. And what that means is that they're just absolutely incredible, their lifespan compared to other comparable mammals of the same size. It's just remarkable that there's this incredible diversity of length of life. And what's even more incredible about these naked mole rats is, again, they have they appear to have negligible senescence. They've got a risk of death that doesn't change very much with time. They can scurry around the little underground burrows that they inhabit just as quickly, no matter how old they are, and so on. Even though they look incredibly wrinkly throughout their lives, these creatures don't age. And they also seem to be resistant to a number of age-related diseases. It was thought for a very long time that naked mole rats were entirely immune to cancer. We've actually, since studying enormous colonies of these things, found a handful of naked mole rats that do get tumours. But nonetheless, it's much, much rarer, because if you look at mice, basically all lab mice die of cancer. It's an incredibly common cause of death. So, what is it that makes these naked mole rats live so much longer, not become frail, not die on the same schedule as a mouse, which is, a comparable mammal of a very, very similar size? Well, this is a really good opportunity to ask the question, how does aging evolve? What is it about the process of evolution by natural selection that allows aging to become, a thing? And the first theories of evolution of aging were very simple theories. They were theories that basically old animals, they were old, they were clapped out, they were decrepit, and so they should try and die to make space for the younger animals in the species. And you can sort of see why this makes sense, because every animal, no matter how old it is going to need to eat food to survive. And there's an amount of food, a limited amount of food in an environment. And so if those older animals are consuming all the food while the sort of young animals are competing with them for that, then the old animals are effectively taking up space which could be being released for those younger animals. They're being selfish. And so the older animals, the theory went, sort of fall on their sword for the good of the species. Now there are two big problems with this theory. The first is that it assumes what it's trying to prove. The theory goes that the older animals are less fit than the younger animals, which is why they have to die to make space for them. That means that it's assuming the aging process in order to prove that aging exists. So that's the first fundamental issue with it. The second issue is that it relies on something called group selection, the idea that animals might do something that's good for the group rather than for the individual. And what modern evolutionary biology thinks is, well, group selection, it probably happens in a few weird niche edge cases. But by and large, the unit of selection in evolution, the unit of natural selection, is the individual, or more fundamentally, it's the genes inside those individuals. And you can think about that because in order to maintain this sort of honourable falling on their sword in order to help the good of the species, this forms a sort of uneasy altruistic truce between all the animals in that species. So if you imagine that one of these animals suddenly, imagine they've all got a death gene, and that death gene means that they die at age 5. Imagine one of these animals gets a mutation in that death gene, which means that it doesn't die until the age of 6. What's it going to do with that extra year of life? Well, it might have more babies. It's got an extra year in which to reproduce, to bring up its kids, make sure those kids are getting a really good start in the wild, and so on. And what that means is, if it gets lucky, it might have more children than an animal that only lives 5 years. And evolution, although we call it survival of the fittest, that's the sort of the thing that's entered into popular consciousness about evolution. Actually, evolution is the process by which things are good at reproducing reproduce more often than things that are less good at reproducing. And when you put it that way, it sounds sort of circular, but it's actually also kind of obvious. And I think is the most fundamental definition of how it is that evolution works. So when an animal has a bit longer to reproduce because it lives to 6 rather than 5, it has more kids. Then those kids are going to live to 6 as well because they inherit that genetic mutation that allowed it to live a bit longer. And they will increase in number. And slowly, these animals that can live longer are going to come to dominate in the population. And this could happen even if it's detrimental to the species as a whole. It might now mean that there are too many of these creatures and they end up eating all of the food or eating too much food, and some of them start to die of starvation. But nonetheless, because it's beneficial to the individual, there's very, very little in evolution that's going to stop that trait spreading. And then, if another mutation comes along that allows the animals to live 7 years, and so on, it's just going to cause that to spread throughout the species. And so that group selection idea has largely fallen out of favour. So the question is that, if evolution is survival of the fittest or reproduction of those that are optimal at reproducing, what is fitness or reproduction optimizing about growing old? And well, there are a couple of different ways to answer this question. I'm going to tell you one of the modern theories of the evolution of aging, perhaps the simplest one, to explain how evolution doesn't select necessarily for aging, although it can do sometimes in some other theories. This theory shows you how aging appears as sort of not evolution's preference, but as natural selection's neglect. And so the way that I'm going to explain this is by showing you something called a survival curve. And this is a very simple kind of graph. What you've got going on here is you've got how old the animals are along the bottom. Let's imagine these are some imaginary kinds of rodents, and so they can live, we're going to be talking about animals living up to, say, 7 years on the x-axis. Then going up on the y-axis, we've got how many of those animals are still alive at a given time. So let's stick a sort of hypothetical survival curve onto this graph. What you can see is obviously they're all alive at the very beginning, 100%. And then as time goes on, the number of animals that are alive slowly decreases until the last one dies somewhere a little bit more than 3 years old. Now let's imagine this is in a population where there isn't any aging. The animals, they don't get cancer, they don't get heart disease, they don't have all these intrinsic causes of death. All they have is external factors, things like disease. That these are, say they're rodents, something a bit like a mouse. They've got disease, they've got predators like cats that are killing them. They can even just die of exposure because it's just so cold. In the winter, they've got tiny little bodies. It's very, very hard to keep that something with such a surface area to volume ratio alive in very, very cold weather. So they can just die that way. So there are loads of random ways these animals can die, and eventually it means that they end up all dying by about 3 years old. So I said this is called the mutation accumulation theory of aging. This is one of the simplest theories of aging. Imagine that these animals develop a mutation. It's a gene that we're going to call. I was also going to say. And imagine this is their reproductive span here. So this is the time in which they can reproduce. And as I mentioned earlier, evolution fundamentally is about reproduction. So the most important thing to these creatures, is basically how big is the area of this reproductive span. If that can either be bigger horizontally because they can have a bit more time to reproduce, or bigger vertically because more of the animals are alive during that time, then those animals are going to be more successful. They're going to pass on more of their genes. They're going to have more babies, and that trait is going to spread throughout the population. So now imagine that a gene appears in these animals. I'm going to call this gene Death1. And what this gene does is it kills animals that get to that particular age. And this gene is going to kill animals that make it to 3 years old. Now let's have a look at what that means on this graph. By the age of 3, only a handful of animals are still alive. So that just means that those, I'm not going to actually show this here because I couldn't be bothered to adjust this on the graph, because it's only this tiny, tiny number of animals down here are going to suddenly die at age 3. And this isn't a problem, because firstly, only a handful of animals are even alive at that stage. But secondly, and more importantly, from an evolutionary perspective, they actually stopped reproducing a while before that, which means that this gene doesn't have any effect on reproduction. And that means, as far as evolution is concerned, it just doesn't care. This is called the weakening force of natural selection. Natural selection is a really strong, powerful imperative to deal with things that happen during the reproductive period, but can't really do very much about things that happen after the reproductive period, because it's too late. You've passed on your genes. There's nothing it can do. So they might even accumulate a second gene, Death2. This one is even less relevant because although it would hypothetically kill an animal that made it to 5 years old, none of the animals do make it to 5 years old. And so these mutations accumulate in the population. That's why it's called the mutation accumulation theory. And that's how these animals, eventually come to age. And although I've talked about these two very simple genes that literally kill the animals when they reach a certain point, actually aging can be caused by a whole range of different genes that have a much smaller, perhaps a cumulative deleterious effect that slowly make it more likely that you're going to get frail or going to get diseased or going to die as you get older. So this is one of the ideas behind why we age. So let's have a look at what would happen if the lifespan of these organisms changed. So imagine now that some of these little rodents make it to an island, and this island has a much lower much lower extrinsic death rate, I should say. So it's sort of external causes of mortality. Things like, there are fewer predators, there's less disease or whatever it is. And that means, and let's ignore these Death1 and Death2 genes for the second, what that means is they just live longer. You can see that the oldest animals here are making it to more than 7 years old. And something that's really, really common in animals that live longer is they often extend their reproductive lifespan. They might take a little bit longer to reach reproductive maturity, but then they might have fewer babies, they might have them less often, they might devote more resources to any individual kid, and that means they can bring it up in a way that's going to mean hopefully it survives for a little bit longer. But now we've had this sort of change in their physiology, change in their genetics. Suddenly that Death1 gene is really bad news, and it's now significant enough that I am going to draw on the change. What you can see is, let's imagine Death1 kills half of the animals, and then Death2 finishes off all of those animals that have, thankfully made it that far without being killed by Death1. This huge red area here, it's a huge subtraction in the reproductive capacity. So this bit that was up here has been completely lost, and then only this half of animals that survive are able to reproduce in that later part of their lives. And so what that's going to mean is there's a huge reproductive cost to Death1. And that means any animals that evolve to have a random mutation that gets rid of death one are going to experience a huge advantage. They're going to gain back that sort of extra reproductive capacity up here. And that's going to mean that they continue to perpetuate, and that death one gene will probably be eradicated from the population. However, what you can see here is that death 2 still isn't significant. It still happens after the reproductive lifespan. Maybe if there's some sort of parental or grandparental effect where it's handy to stick around after you've reproduced and look after your kids or your grandkids, there might be some reason to try and get rid of that gene, but ultimately it might stick around in the population. So that just gives you a really simple idea of how natural selection doesn't necessarily have to evolve aging sort of on purpose, but it can just happen by accident. And actually, there are a bunch of other theories that I'm not going to go into in huge detail. There's a huge and fascinating computational literature on this. One of the most famous models for the mutation accumulation theory is something called the Penna Model. And what's quite interesting is that rather than this very, very simple model I presented here, it actually reproduces the exponential increase in risk of death. So, risk of death that doubles every X years like we observe in humans. So it does appear to have at least a sort of ring of natural selection truth to it. So as I say, I haven't really got time to go into huge detail about this, but if you're interested in this, it's a fascinating computational area, both in terms of sort of explicit theories that are explicit computational models that are trying to understand aging, and in terms of a few really interesting cases where aging has evolved basically by accident in a computational world that was being built to study something completely different. Okay, so let's return to this slide. The consequences of those evolutionary theories are basically all of these things on here that I discussed very, very early in the talk. This whole range of different problems that accumulate as we age. And actually, what I've done here is a bit of a cheat. All of these things are categories. They represent a huge number of different problems, of different dysfunctions, of different issues. So there are hundreds of kinds of cancer. There are so many different ways that you can lose your vision or your memory. Different processes happening at loads of different physiological levels. So this slide is really a cheat. If you were to somehow enumerate all of the age-related diseases and all of the age-related problems, you need to have very, very tiny text. It would absolutely fill the background behind me, even if we had an absolutely enormous space in which to draw all of these things. And the ways in which we tackle them in modern medicine are often sort of palliative or dealing with the end stages in a very isolated way. So something like cancer, for example. If you get cancer, you might receive chemotherapy for the cancer, but very rarely will the other diseases that you have at the same time be treated in a holistic way. You'll see an oncologist about your cancer, you'll see your cardiologist about your heart problems, and these things, often there won't be a huge amount of talking between each of those doctors. As I said, a lot of them are dealt with palliatively, something like muscle loss. We don't even classify that as a disease, or at least haven't until very recently. And the ways that we try and deal with that are things like, we give people walking sticks, or we give them ways to assist their living around the house. We don't fundamentally, try and tackle the aging biology that's causing them to lose that muscle mass in the first place. So those are the problems with this slide. If you were to ask an aging biologist what is aging, then the modern answer would look something a little bit more like this. And these are the 10 hallmarks of aging that I talk about in the book. They're the 10 fundamental cellular, molecular, biological processes that drive the process of getting old. I don't expect you to read all of these now. I know that some of them have some big science words in that don't necessarily mean they're obvious what they are at first glance. But this list is actually really, really exciting. And it's exciting for a couple of different reasons. The first reason is there are just fewer things on this list than there were on the previous one. And that's not to say that these aren't categories themselves. If we look at, for example, this one, protein problems, there are loads of proteins in your body and they can go wrong in myriad different ways. But nonetheless, I think there are fewer things on this list on a conceptual level than on that previous list. There are fewer fundamental causes of aging than ways in which these fundamental causes can cause your body to go wrong. The second thing that's really exciting is that we can develop therapies. We've got ideas for therapies for all of these different changes. And what that means is that if we can go in and fix these changes, we could potentially be attacking the root causes of aging and thereby attack this whole range of cancer, of heart disease, of frailty, all of these different problems at once. Even the cosmetic things like wrinkles and grey hair are caused by these same hallmarks. And so we could come up with one drug or one treatment that could potentially attack or prevent multiple of these things happening, or even all of these things happening simultaneously. And this is why the analogy that the fact that this could be the greatest revolution in medicine since the discovery of antibiotics is such an apt analogy. Because in much the same way as one antibiotic can treat a number of bacterial infections, one treatment for one of these hallmarks could potentially treat or even prevent a whole range of age-related problems. Now, as you'll be relieved to hear this early in the morning, I've not got time to go through the whole list. What I thought I'd do is just give you an example to try and explain, in a slightly less abstract terms what this means. I want to talk about the accumulation of senescent cells. These are cells, remember that I said that senescent is just the scientific biological word for old, for aged. And I want to talk about how these cells accumulate, what we can do about it, and how that has an incredibly wide-ranging effect on our biology. So senescent cells, as I said, the word just means aged cells. And these are cells that have aged in a number of different ways. They can either have accumulated a lot of damage to their DNA, so that's damage to the DNA instruction manual at the center of every one of our cells. And if your cells accumulate damage or mutations in that DNA, so sort of errors in the code basically, then what that can do is it can predispose a cell to becoming cancerous. And your body really doesn't want cancer to happen. Cancer is something that we know kills a huge, huge amount of complex life. And so evolution has evolved a huge number of different defenses against cancer. And one of these is senescence. If a cell accumulates a bunch of DNA damage, it stops dividing. And that is the definition of a senescent cell. It's a cell that perhaps was dividing before, but no longer has that ability to divide. And that's a great thing in terms of preventing cancer. Because what is cancer fundamentally? It's a disease of cells that can divide indefinitely. They can divide enough times that eventually they form a massive tumor. They can carry on dividing and metastasize. They can spread around the body. That's what that means. And that's ultimately how cancer goes on to kill you, because that cell just carries on dividing, using up resources, and eventually strangling the rest of your body effectively. So DNA damage and mutations is one way. Another way is that a cell can just have divided too many times. And again, you can see exactly as I just said, if cancer is a disease of cell division, it's a disease of cells that divide too many times, then it's another very safe idea for your body to stop a cell that's divided a lot of times from dividing anymore. Not necessarily knowing whether it's going to be cancerous or not, but it's a safe bet that if you stop that cell dividing, you're potentially going to nip cancer in the bud. So that's a really, really important process. And what happens when you're young is that this process works exactly as intended. A cell with DNA damage or mutations, or that's divided too many times, then ends up stopping dividing. And what it does then is it doesn't just sit there, sort of not dividing, but not really doing anything, a benign elder of the cellular community perhaps, but it starts pumping out a cocktail of molecules. And the purpose of those molecules is to attract over the immune system. It's basically saying, hey, look, I'm over here, I'm senescent, I'm not really doing my job, can you come and clear me up? And in a young person, this process causes an immune cell, a macrophage probably, to come over, gobble up that cell, and then hopefully that's problem solved. And when you're young, that process sort of works basically as it's intended. But as you get older, there are two different factors, or actually a whole range of different factors, but two sort of broad factors that cause that process to sort of start to go out of kilter. Firstly, you're accumulating senescent cells a lot more quickly because your cells, they've had longer to accumulate damage or mutations in their DNA, or they've had longer to divide more times. So there are more ways that cells can become senescent. And secondly, your immune system is starting to get less good at clearing them up because it itself is getting old. It's weakening. It's just basically busy doing other stuff, or it's just in this sort of chronic inflammatory state, we call it, of a sort of heightened paranoia throughout your whole body. And what that means is the senescent cells are being produced more often, they're being cleared up less effectively, so everything gets out of balance and the number of those senescent cells increases. Now, unfortunately, that cocktail of molecules that they're pumping out to attract the immune system is toxic to the rest of your body if it continues being emitted. And actually, this is thought to be one of the driving forces behind a whole range of different problems in the aging process. So this is something, senescent cells, they accumulate with time. Their accumulation is bad because they can pump out these toxic molecules that can accelerate aging, and ultimately they can cause a whole range of different age-related problems. This is a classic example of a hallmark of aging. And again, it might be quite a depressing thesis. If all we knew was that these things accumulated with time and they were one of the drivers of aging, that's just a terrible thing. And this is one of the reasons that we get more likely to get diseases and die as we get older. But what's really exciting is we've got drugs that can do something about this. So in 2015, scientists did an experiment where they gave 24-month-old mice, and mice, they have a much shorter lifespan than people we've already talked about. 24-month-old mice are basically equivalent to 70-year-old people in human terms. And what that means is you're giving these drugs to pretty old mice. They're mice that have accumulated a lot of senescent cells. And if you give them one of these so-called senolytic drugs that can kill the senescent cells, then they basically get biologically younger. Removing these cells makes them less likely to get cancer, they're less likely to get cataracts, they're less likely to get heart disease. But it's not just diseases. They also get less frail, they're fitter, they can run further and faster on a little mousy treadmill that's used in these experiments. They even have better fur. Which is just incredible because I'm a computational biologist. I've not dealt with mice in the lab, and yet it's just blindingly obvious that these mice, they just look great. And so what this shows us is that killing these senescent cells with this kind of senolytic drug can effectively globally reverse the aging process. It can affect not just the diseases, it can make the mice live longer, I didn't mention that, but it can make them less frail, it can even make them look better. All the cosmetic changes seem to be wrapped up in the same way too. And this is the dream of anti-aging medicine, a pill that you could give to somebody that would prevent them from becoming ill in the first place, and not just prevent them from getting ill from one specific disease, but the whole range of age-related problems. Now, this isn't just some sort of theoretical idea on the lab bench. Not only have we got this working in mice, but the first human trials of these senolytic drugs started in 2018, and there are actually 20 or 30 companies trying to turn this from an idea on the lab bench to an idea in the clinic. So this is something that could be with us incredibly, incredibly soon, and that's why I'm so excited about the idea of dealing with senescent cells. So that's one of the hallmarks on this list. And what's exciting, as I mentioned, is that we've got ideas to treat every single one of these hallmarks. And by going after all of them, this is how we could potentially begin to treat and maybe even iterate towards a cure for the aging process. Because once we've got something that can deal with every single one of these, then we're hopefully going to be able to address many of the underlying causes of age-related disease. But there's a problem with this. I think even if we manage to come up with a treatment for every single one of these 10 hallmarks, in fact, every single subcategory within those 10 hallmarks, I think we'd probably do great things for human health, human lifespan, what's called health span, how long we live in good health before we start to succumb to diseases. But I don't think that would be a cure for aging. I don't think that would make humans negligibly senescent. And I'd just like to give you a quick idea of why. And this is fundamentally why computational science is going to play such a key role when it comes to dealing with these issues. So let's talk about the example of senescent cells, because that's the one that I've already given you a bit of a background on. What causes cellular senescence? So I mentioned DNA damage and mutations. There's also these things called telomeres. You've probably heard of. They're one of the most common questions you get as an aging biologist. They're effectively a counter of how many times your cells divided. So I said cells are divided too many times. If their telomeres become what's called critically short, a cell can become senescent. So those are two processes that cause cellular senescence. But then cellular senescence, we've already discussed, has impacts. It can cause what's then called cellular exhaustion, the process by which cells in your body, certain populations, become too few in number to perform their function, or perhaps they just stop working. We said that senescent cells stop dividing; they stop providing the function that they're supposed to be doing when they're fully functional cells. So they can contribute to the exhaustion of populations of cells in your body, which is another cause of aging. They also change the signaling. I mentioned this toxic cocktail of molecules that goes out, it stimulates your immune system and can cause all kinds of changes around your body. So they contribute to another hallmark of aging there as well. And those signaling changes, actually, ironically, one of the things they can do is cause more cells to become senescent, causing this sort of terrible vicious cycle. So that shows you just, again, how these things are all related back and forth in very complicated ways. There's also a relationship between signaling changes in the immune system. Changes in the immune system can be driven by the signaling. It can cause this chronic inflammatory state I mentioned, and changes in the immune system can drive this inflammation and change the signaling in your body and change the behavior of cells and organs all around the body. Then there's also an interrelationship between senescent cells and the immune system. I said that as you get older, the immune system gets less good at clearing out the senescent cells. And why does the immune system get less good? Well, for a variety of reasons, but one of them is because the cells in the immune system are going senescent. Now, I went through that very, very quickly, and I don't necessarily expect you to have followed every single last bit of it, because my main point here wasn't to give you a really detailed understanding of how senescent cells link to all the other hallmarks of aging. It was to show you that this stuff is hugely, hugely interconnected. And this is why computational science is going to be absolutely key to understanding the biology of aging. Because even if we treat cellular senescence, we're going to find that loads of other things get impacted at the same time. And some of them will be good. We've seen basically that when we give these drugs to mice, it seems to impact positively on almost every aspect of their biology. But anyone who's dealt with anything in biology or medicine will know that often, drugs have side effects, and these things are going to have negative side effects as well as positive ones. And this is why I think it's so important to take a computational approach trying to understand what's going on here. Because the hallmarks of aging, they aren't the whole of aging. They aren't telling us everything about how aging is caused. I see them as, and because I'm coming at you from the UK here, I'm going to use a British analogy. I see the hallmarks as stations on the London tube map. They're not the whole map. They're just the names of the key interchanges. And what we really need to do to understand the aging process is to flesh out that whole map, draw all the different lines on and show how these different interchanges are connected to one another. Our bodies are these incredibly complicated networks of interactions. That everything within cells, and the cells can talk, within themselves, they can talk to each other, they can talk to cells on the other side of the body. This can all be driven by these signaling changes that happen throughout our bodies as we get older. And these interactions don't just happen between things, but they can happen, within systems themselves. There can be feedback loops. This is all incredibly complicated. We've got 20,000 genes. We can potentially make about 100,000 proteins inside our body. It's just an incredibly, incredibly complicated place. And surely the only way to describe these incredibly complicated interactions is to do so mathematically and computationally. And that's why I think to truly cure aging, we're going to need to embrace an idea called systems biology. This is the idea that we can create a computer model for the whole functioning of the human organism. We can understand everything that's going on at the DNA level, the instruction manual. We can look at the proteins, we can look at the cells, we can look at how they're interacting on every possible level. And this is going to require a huge collaboration between computational scientists and practicing biologists, because the biologists are going to have to collect all this data, which the computational scientists then need to integrate into models that explain how it is that the human body works. We need to understand the interactions, and then I think fundamentally, to deal with aging, we need to intervene in a more subtle way. Because a lot of our treatments at the moment, it's like, we've noticed that senescent cells become more prevalent with age. Let's get rid of all the senescent cells and see what happens. And actually, we've been surprisingly lucky. This has borne a lot of fruit, and I'm very excited about the near-term treatments for aging. What we really want to do is go in and restore balance effectively to the body. And that can sound a bit sort of new age and kooky. But what we need is, we need to restore homeostasis, and that's the process by which our bodies maintain their stability. So I already mentioned that someone in their 20s or 30s has a less than 1 in 1,000 chance of dying in that year. That's absolutely incredible. It means that it's keeping every single aspect of your physiology to within such tight constraints that the chance of you sort of falling off one way or the other in such an extreme way as it to actually kill you is less than 1 in 1,000 a year. It's just phenomenal. So if we can take some of the changes that are more gradual, that happen not over minutes or over years, but over decades, and sort of drag those back to a more youthful state, then our body's own homeostatic mechanisms are what's going to keep us alive. And ultimately, I think that's how we're going to see all of medicine, as a sort of systems biology way to try and intervene and understand the homeostasis of the body and maintain that homeostatic state, maintain that steady stability, and keep us alive, keep us healthy. I think that the mathematization of biology is going to massively enhance our ability to describe and predict what's going on inside our biology. But, when you hear all this, you might be thinking, wow, Andrew, this sounds sci-fi. And honestly, I was thinking this myself. I start talking about systems biology in the last science chapter of the book. And I was thinking, this sounds crazy. This is surely something that's miles and miles away into the future. But actually, then I started thinking about it. I thought, let's imagine this is 50 years away. And not to be selfish, but I'm just going to try and imagine this from my own point of view for a moment. I'm in my 30s now. And so in 50 years' time, I'm going to be in my 80s. And even if we don't make any significant strides in aging biology in the next 50 years, I think I can fairly confidently imagine that I'm going to live comfortably into my 80s, because that's what current life expectancy is for someone in their 30s in a relatively rich part of the world. That means that I've got 50 years for scientists to start developing these systems biology models. And in fact, I've got a little bit longer because, maybe I'll take some early sanalytics or some of these early single hallmark treatments that might extend my lifespan a little bit further. What that means then is that, potentially I'm going to be around in time to experience these models. And if we look back at what's happened in the last 50 years, the progress in biology, the progress in collecting data, we've gone from barely understanding what the structure of DNA is to being able to sequence a whole genome in an afternoon for $1,000. And in computation, I don't need to tell anyone, I actually looked up last night, in 1971, 50 years ago, the 8-inch floppy disk was just made commercially available. And now we've got a computer that's more powerful than a room-sized computer in the 70s that we all carry around in our pockets at all times. So there really is a huge potential to collect much more data, to have huge computational models, to have machine learning, to have special chips that can try and understand this stuff much, much faster. I think you'd be a fool to bet against having these huge systems biology models in 50 years' time. And therefore, I think there's this huge, huge potential for it to affect people, not just in some far future sci-fi sense, but in a sense that could very much affect people who are alive today. And fundamentally, that's why I wrote this book. I wanted to try and make people really, really excited about the potential for aging biology, to show them the huge, huge advances that can happen, not just in some pie-in-the-sky theoretical way, but in a way that could affect all of us, in the lifetimes of most people who are alive on the planet today. If you want to read a bit more about the book, you can find out more and go and buy it at ageless.link. And I thought I'd also stick up a few social media links if you want to follow me and find out what I've been getting up to. I'm Stato on Twitter, Dr. Andrew Steele on various other things. I think that's about it. And I hope we've got time for a couple of questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, we can see, I saw there were before a few questions in the chat, but even if you have other questions, you can raise your hands. I saw that the questions at the beginning were from Lana. Would you directly to speak and expose your questions, Lana? Or maybe I can directly read them. Is immortality really something we should strive for from an ethical point of view, or is comfortable aging more of an ethical goal? What do you think, Andrew?
I am not massively interested in immortality. I think it's something that journalists spend a lot of time asking us about. But actually, immortality is going to be a far, far future prospect. Because even if we were to cure aging, even if we were to have a risk of death that's constant with time, it would still be a risk of death, right? We're still going to be able to get hit by buses or catch coronavirus or whatever it is in ways that are going to kill us. And I think actually the ethical arguments, this is something that I could give another hour-long talk on if you're interested. But I think that the quickest way to identify the problem with most of the ethical arguments against doing something about aging, firstly, is that it's just an extension of ordinary medical research. If I'd just given a talk on how we could use computational approaches to deal with cancer, for example, no one would have stuck their hand up at the end and said, oh, Andrew, what are we going to do with all these people who are living a bit longer because they've been cured of cancer? Aren't we going to have an overpopulation problem because these people are going to be sticking around for longer lives? Aren't they going to get bored in their extended lives? No one had asked that. But the fact is that aging biology seems to sit in this special ethical and social category. So the way that I like to answer that question is to turn the question around. Imagine we lived in a society where aging wasn't a thing, where our risk of death was constant with time, and people lived healthily and right up until the end of potentially much, much extended lifespans. And we had an ethical problem. We had overpopulation. We had inequality of resources. Would you invent aging in order to solve one of these problems? And I think the answer is always no. Aging is this enormous, I've already said I think it's the biggest cause of death and suffering globally. Even if you decided there was some ethical problem, that there was literally no way to get around apart from to kill people, and I should really suggest that that's a sort of matter of last resort, the way that you'd choose to kill them wouldn't be by decades of degeneration and a bunch of horrible diseases that slowly conspire to take their lives. So I think given that the argument against inventing aging in a society where it didn't exist would be so strong, you can spin that around and the same argument applies. We should be trying very, very hard to cure aging because it's going to make a lot of people healthier for an awful lot longer.
Really interesting, thank you. Elana, would you like to add something?
Okay, sorry, now
Yeah.
I can use sound. Yeah, thank you for your answer. My question, you said we wouldn't invent aging, and my question was not really about whether we should suffer or not, but whether we should die or not, even without suffering, because of, for example, there is this research showing that science progresses one death at a time, which basically means that in our societies now, when you age, you hoard resources and power. And there is also this theory of evolved death to manage resources, basically. So even if we don't invent death, maybe evolution did. And,
So I hope I
the last
explain-
point
sorry.
was that if you're 20 years old in a society where everyone is 200 years old and they have had 200 years old to amass resources, it sounds a bit hard.
Yeah, so I think there are a few different points there. To address the second one first, I actually explained earlier in the talk why evolution doesn't create death. I think that's a real sort of misunderstanding of how evolution works. Because it works on the individual level, not on the species level. It doesn't develop these things, for the good of the species. Some things, the evolution of aging and the evolution of death have basically happened as evolutionary accidents. In terms of the answer to your other questions about accrual of resources and science advancing funeral by funeral, the first point I'd make is that this just isn't how I'd solve this problem. If we do find some massive inequality between 200 years and 20-year-olds, is the solution to shoot the 200-year-olds? Or even worse, is the solution to allow them to degenerate slowly over time? I just don't see that as a viable way of dealing with this. And in terms of science advancing funeral by funeral, I read a fascinating paper that looked at, obviously they couldn't look at death from old age because that's something that afflicts everybody at the moment, but they looked at areas of science where individuals died early. So that they looked at where exceptional researchers had died, in a car accident or something that had taken them away in the prime of their research career. And the first thing they found was that the actual impact on science was quite ambiguous. They found that there was a huge impact. Obviously, that person stopped publishing, but so did a lot of their collaborators. And they found that, that the net amount of publications stayed about the same, but there were just a lot of new ideas introduced into the field because that titan had been removed, basically. And it's really not clear to me, I think it would vary on a field by field basis, whether it's better to go really deeply into the exploration of something that's a very important and dominant paradigm at that time, or whether it is better to diversify at some point and start, exploring further theories. That's something that's really contingent, and I'm not sure we have the answer to. However, I think the fact that this research was able to show that researchers who die early do cause this massive upheaval in the way their science is published, what that suggests is that science is already affected by the lifespans of human beings. This is a problem that we already have to solve. This isn't something that's going to rear its ugly head in 100 years' time when people are living to 150. This is happening now. And I really think the solution to these kinds of problems isn't aging, it's to have term limits. It's to say, you can only be a professor for 30 years, then you have to stand down and stop publishing and move into a different field or get a different job. We already have this idea for politicians. Presidents in the US, for example, can only serve 2 4-year terms. And that's just a really good way to make sure people don't hang on to power. So I think the solutions to these problems are all social rather than biological.
Nice, thank you. So there are many questions. I'm sorry we are a bit late, so I would try maybe to ask to another one, but that is on another point of view. For example, there is Emily Dawson that wrote, do you think that publicizing this science more widely might help us motivate society more to address long-term collective problems like climate change?
I really hope so. And I actually think that one of the positive externalities of people living longer is that it's going to be less acceptable to leave problems like climate change. Because, apart from anything else, it will directly affect you. I actually think this is going to apply to all forms of human suffering and death. Because currently, imagine you die in a car accident in your 20s. That's currently considered a tragedy because it's going to rob you of another 50 or 60 years of life. Imagine if that robbed you of another 200 years of life. Suddenly the tragedy is just a huge amount greater. And it's the same with problems like war. We send soldiers to war. It's terrible when they die. But imagine again that you are robbing these young soldiers of potentially centuries of life. I really hope that the world can become a kinder and sort of more forward-looking place if we live a bit longer. So yeah, I hope there will be these positive externalities.
Nice, thank you.